How do we mute this again? There's me. All right, it's muted. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission's IRP Contemporary Issues Workshop. And you might have noticed things are a little bit different this year, obviously. I would have preferred to have this as a face-to-face meeting, but circumstances dictate otherwise. And we are trying out a different setup here. All of us who will be speaking will be on the WebEx, and then you, the viewers, will be on YouTube. Let me go through the technology a little bit. As you can see, we're being streamed through YouTube, and our presenters are hosting today's IRP Technical Conference via WebEx. As in previous years, the link will be posted to the Commission's webpage afterwards. So you'll be able to always access this recording on YouTube. The purpose of streaming the IRP Technical Conference through YouTube is to allow a greater audience to join, help eliminate additional background noise, and provide a forum for questions regarding the topics of discussion. Presenters on the WebEx forum, please make sure your lines are muted unless it is your turn to present or answer questions. We have a full agenda today, including discussions on RTOs, resource adequacy, implications of a changing resource mix, and transmission planning. And then this afternoon, we'll also have a DER roundtable hosted by Dr. Doug Gotham from the State Utility Forecasting Group. As is stated on the agenda, if you have questions during today's presentations, you can ask them in the live chat box next to the video box on YouTube. Bob Pauley will then ask them, read them to the presenters as they are received and as time allows. If you have technical issues with the live chat functions or with the YouTube stream, please contact Bob Pauley at mpauley, that's L-E-Y, at urc.in.gov. If you have additional questions about the presentations after the IRP Technical Conference, you can send those to Bob as well. And I will note that right now, all of the presentations are on the Commission's webpage, so you can also take a look at them there. And I will now turn it over to Chairman Houston for brief comments, and then we will quickly dive into it.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Brad, for helping pull this together. It's a great opportunity. I want to first off say thank you to both of the RTOs, the respective regulator teams and liaisons. You guys have done a tremendous job. This particular forum, its genesis is rooted in some conversation that I had with both the CEOs of the RTOs a little over a year ago on the ongoing and concurrent responsibilities that we have with system reliability. So I just want to say thank you for the RTO's participation today. We value that relationship, not only in today's session, but on an ongoing basis. The IURC takes its job with system reliability enormously serious. Want to thank any policymakers that may be joining us as well. We had sent an invitation out to state representatives and state senators that are involved in the energy sphere. Not sure that we will know until after the fact who may be on, so I apologize for not introducing folks who may be joining us as well. Also like to say thank you to my fellow commissioners. I believe all of them are listening in at least on part of today's technical conference, if not the entire proceedings. And also I want to say thanks to Dr. Borum and the entire research policy and planning team, including Bob Pauley, who you've already heard mentioned, Dave Johnson, and Dale Thomas. They do a tremendous job, not only working on policy and planning for the future, but also providing some of the senior leadership as members of our teams when we were doing rate cases and other proceedings before the commission. We've all read about some of the system challenges going out on the West Coast. Indiana is not California. We take our role in providing and being a part of a system that provides reliable energy on a 24/7 basis, and that a system that is resilient. So our conversations today are enormously timely. And again, I just want to thank MISO and PJM. I know on an ongoing basis, they take that responsibility very, very seriously. Each session today will allow for 10 to 15 minutes of questions. And I think Dr. Borum's kind of outlined some of the ways that you can ask questions, but we wanted to make sure with all the serious subject matter that's being discussed, whether you have a highly technical question or whether you have a very basic question, the opportunity for all of those questions will be a part of today's proceeding. So please write down in notes or send electronic questions to the presenters, and they will be happy to address them during today's session. Again, thank you for participating, and I'll turn it back over to Dr. Borum.
All right, real quickly here, the first topic is going to be the benefits of RTOs, and our speaker on that will be from the PJM. Asim, you want to take over there? And like I said, just lead off with a little bit of who you are, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Dr. Borum. Chairman, can you hear me? Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's truly a privilege. My name is Asim Haq. I am the Vice President of State and Member Services at PJM. So I have basically two core functions that are under my hierarchy there. The first is state policy, and the second is the membership. State policy is something that is near and dear to my heart. I am a former commissioner myself from the state of Ohio, but I have great affections for the state of Indiana. So my wife is actually born and raised Hoosier. I've spent quite a bit of time in beautiful Muncie, Indiana, and eaten my fair share of a pizza joint called the Pizza King. I also think I might have memorized every line of the movie Hoosiers, but that's neither here nor there. I'm going to share a presentation. I'm going to try and do it on my iPad, and I'm hopeful that it works out. Just a second here. Okay, can folks confirm they can see this presentation?
Yes. Excuse me. Yes.
Okay, great. So again, I'm doing this on my iPad. Hopefully it will work out in real time here. But my task here is to represent the RTOs and providing an RTO overview. I will move to the first slide here. And really the first slide is to convey that sort of Indiana's not alone in this RTO construct. RTOs are creations of really the United States Congress and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission through a few orders, primarily orders 888, 889, and 2000, which were issued in the years 96, 96, and 99, respectively. We'll talk about the functions of RTOs in just a moment, but just so the audience knows, there are 9 major RTOs throughout North America. There are conversations actually happening right now in the South and in the West. You'll see that those are pockets of the country that don't have RTO coverage. There are conversations happening down south and out west right now about sort of what iteration of regionalization should exist within those states or within those territories. But we'll focus on the great state of Indiana, which really has coverage from two RTOs. You've got PJM that's there in various pockets in the purple, and MISO that is in the blue. Now, moving on to our next slide, and what I want to say specifically about that relationship. MISO's got a great team. We work well with them, and we have to because of the interstate and interregional nature of the grid. That interregional and interstate nature of the grid is well encapsulated, I think, in this next slide. The Eastern Interconnection is one of two major alternating current electric grids in the continental United States. And you'll see on this slide, you've got the PJM footprint, and then we've articulated where, visually, where the Eastern Interconnection is. The other major interconnection is the Western Interconnection. There are three minor interconnections. That's Quebec, Alaska, and Texas. All of the electric utilities in the Eastern Interconnection are electrically tied together during normal system conditions and operate at a synchronized frequency at an average of 60 hertz. So a point to be made here is that the grid itself, the physical grid, the engineering and physics of the grid is interstate and interregional in nature. And it requires some level of coordination outside of the boundaries of individual states. We work with our neighboring RTOs for PJM, that's MISO and the New York ISO for interregional coordination to ensure that our power flows are appropriate, and especially on our seams or our boundaries of our footprint that we're coordinating appropriately there. So a few statistics specifically about PJM. The first is that we serve 65 million people in our footprint. We cannot fail. And we operate under that premise on a day-to-day basis. The work that PJM, that MISO, that RTOs do in preserving primarily reliability for consumers, and these RTOs have they have their own level of millions of folks that they serve. It is the paramount responsibility. We take it very, very seriously. When I think about, for instance, where we've been situated during the coronavirus, we sequestered some of our dispatchers, and we'll talk about what our operators do on a day-to-day basis for weeks on end. And they did so voluntarily because they believe in the mission of making sure that we are helping to keep the lights on. So a point to be made there, which is that we don't take the 65 million people that are in our footprint, we don't take that responsibility lightly. Also within the footprint, I like to highlight this 84,000 miles of transmission line. We'll talk about specifically what the sort of RTO authority is within that transmission line space, but a statistic that I like to point out to say, the just sort of physical grid element of the footprint is really very vast. And then another statistic to note here is the member companies. We have 1,000+ members. We'll talk about the role of those members and how that plays into the concept of RTO governance here in just a moment. So moving on to my next slide, let's talk about RTO governance for a second. Sometimes that ends up being a hot topic because, frankly, everybody wants their say in what happens at an RTO. But let me just describe PJM's governance structure for just a moment. And actually, not all RTOs have the same governance. In fact, governance looks very different in the various RTOs, and levels of participation from various segments of industry vary from RTO to RTO to RTO. But let's just talk about PJM for just a second. So the first thing to note is that there's an independent board of managers that governs PJM. So I would think of them, in my interactions with our board, I would think of them very similarly to the board of a nonprofit, okay, which is really assisting in setting the strategic direction of the organization, ensuring that we are being good stewards financially, and really the evaluation and the retention of the CEO of the RTO. So that independent board of managers is elected. They have staggered terms, so they're elected. Some are elected annually. Some segment of the board of managers will be elected annually, and so and they're elected by our membership, I should say. Well, let's talk about our membership. What does that look like? So there's an entire universe of what we call PJM stakeholders. Okay. However, membership is pretty clearly defined in our governing documents. There has to be actually a fee paid that's defined within our governing documents to obtain membership. And our members really consist of these 5 sectors: generation owners, transmission owners. We call this third segment in the middle there the concept of other suppliers. It's typically broken up into competitive retail companies and trading companies. Then we've got the electric distribution sector, and then the end use customer sector. So 5 sectors that exist, that 5 member sectors that exist within PJM, broken up into those 5 sectors really for purposes of things like voting on matters. And we also have an independent market monitor there at the upper right, who ensures that PJM's markets, that no entity is exerting market power. So there's no, you don't have an entity that within PJM's markets is exhibiting sort of behavior that you wouldn't want exhibited, is the way I'll put it. And the market monitor is also very active, very independent in its own right, can be active in FERC proceedings, can be active in state proceedings. But generally speaking, this is the overall sort of PJM governance model. I view states and state commissions as very important stakeholders, almost view them, and I've got to be careful about what I say, as sort of superseding members, and for the very reason that state commissions, state policymakers, they have the ability to create policy that ends up impacting what PJM does on a day-to-day basis. Whether that's markets related policy, whether that's policy related to transmission planning, there's quite a bit of activity that happens within the states in the energy space that we have to be very thoughtful of, and determine how we can best incorporate those policies into what PJM does. And the other thing I'll say is that state commissions, specifically through an organization called the Organization of PJM States, they have the ability to meet and speak with our board members and are not governed by ex parte rules, which our members are governed by. And so when we think about where states are situated in the governance process, the ability to have really closed door discussions with our board is something that states have the opportunity to do that our members actually do not. One other point about governance and where these RTOs are situated, I think it's important to note that these organizations, PJM specifically, because I know it's governance best, it's a revenue neutral organization. So it's not, it does not exist to turn a profit. So what we intake is governed actually via FERC tariff. We are not publicly traded. We don't have shareholders. We don't do things like quarterly earnings calls. We are somewhere in between sort of the model that you'll see with the concept of being sort of a publicly traded public utility and government. We're somewhere in between on that spectrum, but I think it's important to note because we'll do education in states, and a fair question that will be asked of me is, what do you get out of this? Why are you here advocating? What are you getting out of this education? And the honest to goodness truth is that the mission of these RTOs, I believe, is very, very strong. I really enjoyed my work as a state commissioner, really felt like we were doing the public good. I think, coming out of that experience, the RTO space, from a mission perspective, is, frankly, one of the better sort of transitions that I could have found, because the mission of, keeping the lights on, doing so at costs that are affordable to consumers, is a strong mission. Again, these organizations, mission driven, not here to make a profit. Okay, so now we get into the nuts and bolts of what the RTO does on a day-to-day basis. These core functions, planning, operations, and markets. I would say that it is likely that most RTOs share in the first two functions, planning and operations. And so what are those things? So planning, the analogy we like to make, whether it's the right analogy or not, I'm not sure, is the concept of urban planning. Every city, every county, every state does some element of local and regional planning for its city or its county or its community. PJM will look at its entire footprint, and specifically on the transmission side, we'll take a 15-year outlook and we'll say, where do we need to build out transmission? Where is there load growth? Where will there be generation retirements so that perhaps transmission needs to be built to continue to get power from point A to point Z? Where's there congestion on the system? And so the idea here is that there's got to be an entity. Remember the interconnected nature of the grid, the Eastern Interconnect. There's got to be an entity or entities that are doing that level of sort of interstate planning for the grid, for the transmission system. And that's what our planning folks do. Operations. So, this is really something. And, when I, the bulk of my knowledge base coming to an RTO, and I've been here since, been at PJM since March of 2019. The bulk of my understanding about what RTOs did was really on the market side, because that's where you really hear about RTOs the most, whether that's, ills associated with the market, associated with clean energy or affordability, or, really real positives to say about the market, associated with being able to incent cleaner generation or being able to incent, very robust reserve so that, frankly, we're not running out of power in the footprint. So again, spent a lot of time talking about, thinking about, advocating for the state of Ohio, where I was previously, about the concept of markets. But operations is an extraordinarily important function, not just of an RTO, but frankly, the underlying fabric of our society. If you actually go to one of these RTO control rooms, you will see in real time operators delivering power from point A to point Z, working with transmission owners, generation owners to ensure that power, a watt, is generated, is transmitted, and appropriately gets to the distribution level, where folks like your local distribution utilities will then take that power and distribute it to its customers. It is a heck of a process. It's very mathematical in nature. And if you ever get the opportunity, once the virus is done here, if you ever get the opportunity to come and visit PJM's control room in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, I think it'll really, I would love to give you that tour, and it's really something to behold. And of course, MISO's got its contemporary as well. So from just purely an RTO perspective, that's one thing that I really want to emphasize, is that this concept of operations is something that gets overlooked a little bit. But again, extraordinarily important to really the underlying fabric of our economy and our society, making sure that power gets from point A to point Z. The last component really is markets. So, generators bid into these markets, load serving entities procure power from these markets. We have a number of different markets, both very short term and long term markets. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about those marketplaces here in just a moment. So this is maybe an easier way to think about what an RTO does. This is sort of a more sort of policy take, keeping the lights on, planning for the future, and facilitating efficient electricity trading, planning, operations, markets, all balled up into sort of these, I would say, sort of policy priorities. I think, frankly, keeping the lights on is the ultimate sort of paramount responsibility, the ultimate mission-driven component from where PJM sits right now. And again, I'll talk about the virus, I'll talk about the coronavirus. We have seen incredibly dynamic changes in where we see our load forecasting. So, how much people are consuming, whether it's residential consumers or industrial consumers. We've seen changes in that. We've had to react sort of dynamically to those changes, not to mention making sure that we keep our dispatchers, which, you can't just hire somebody who is an effective engineer from somewhere to do this work. They have to have quite a bit of certification, quite a bit of training in order to do these jobs. And so keeping them healthy as well, keeping the lights on, again, job one for PJM and RTOs alike. This is propaganda. I freely admit it. But just to show you, we have been able to quantify the value across the footprint. We give a range just to make sure we're being honest about it. We've got quite a bit of data to back this up, but this is the quantifiable dollar value proposition associated with being part of a regional RTO. MISO's got its own numbers. These are PJM's numbers. New England ISO has its own numbers. And this is really because of, frankly, the economies of scope and scale that can be created as opposed to smaller pockets trying to go about doing this, effectively power generation and power transmittal on its own. Okay, let me talk for just a second about the PJM, the markets that PJM administrates. And so, like this slide, it shows you from a sort of time-based perspective, the marketplaces that are advancing in pretty close to real time, and marketplaces that are more so long-term markets. If you follow RTOs, one of the more sort of controversial components right now in the RTO space is this concept of the capacity market, resource adequacy. This is something that I know we're going to dive into in some detail here with our next panel. But just a point to make about the capacity market. So that's one of the long-term markets. If you see there, it's a 3-year forward-looking market meant to procure resource adequacy for those states that have sort of this competitive generation space. In Indiana, you don't have tremendous interaction with the capacity market because Indiana and Michigan Power is what's called a fixed resource requirement entity in the state. So not relying on the capacity market for this concept of resource adequacy. So, something that we don't necessarily have to spend a lot of time talking about. But the point that I want to make is that this capacity market has been the subject of a lot of discussion at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and then just sort of within the public sphere. So when you really think about it, this is one marketplace in a series of marketplaces that PJM operates. It actually represents, anywhere from 10 to 20% of generator revenue for those who actually participate in these markets. Again, not happening in Indiana, but something like 10 to 20% of generator revenue. It's the energy market. So you'll look there, you've got in the sort of real time and day ahead. Our energy markets are encapsulated within those buckets. And so the point I want to make is that, the markets are important. The resource adequacy component of what we do with the capacity market is important. But I just want to emphasize that that is sort of a portion of a portion of a portion of the overall sort of value proposition of RTOs. Again, when you think about the three core functions of planning, operations, and markets, the concept of keeping the lights on through a planning and operations function, this capacity market issue is something that has been, hot and heavy in PJM for a long time. Something that when I was in Ohio, I paid a lot of attention to. Then you get to PJM and you get to an RTO and you say, wow, the organization is actually a lot more than just this one marketplace that we talk about with consistency. And with Indiana, frankly, it really doesn't have nearly the same level of import because of I&M, at least in the PJM footprint, I&M being this FRR entity, really working through integrated resource planning through the commission and, of course, its own sort of investment decisions. Okay, this next slide. This next slide is really meant to convey that, there are very specific functions that the RTO carries out with respect to the bulk power system. There are other entities in all of this that are extraordinarily important. There are functions like a load serving entity like I&M Power will carry out. They've got immense responsibility themselves to ensure that their distribution system, as well as where they're situated, obviously in the generation space, that they're doing what they need to do in order to serve residents and businesses in the great state of Indiana. There are functions that are generation owners, let's say in competitive states, that have to carry out on their own. And of course, there are functions that our transmission owners carry out on their own. Again, while this is about me explaining some of the benefits of being in an RTO and really expressing some of the value proposition elements of being in an RTO, we don't do it alone. There are a number of entities, within our footprint that play a very, very important part in ensuring that we keep the lights on. I want to make sure that I acknowledge that. With the next slide, you'll see, at least visually, some of that necessary coordination. Look, this is a symphony to get power, to get a watt generated, and then delivered to a consumer in Indiana. It's a symphony that requires quite a bit of coordination. Now you've got boots on the ground with transmission owners and generation owners, communicating at all times with the RTO. You've got the RTO, in its control rooms, observing these operations and making sure that the boots on the ground's commands, if there's an outage, if there's a technical problem with the transmission line, are applied to what the RTO is doing. You've got load serving entities that expect to be able to procure and then deliver power on the distribution system. And of course, you have consumers that really want reliable power at an affordable price, and in this sort of modernization of the grid, maybe want their own choices or their own sort of items added to that mix. Point here being is that it's a heck of a supply chain that requires a lot of coordination. The RTO is sort of at the center of that information gathering and relaying. But again, a lot of important players in this, including the consumer. And it is, again, a symphony that requires quite a bit of coordination. Let me move on to the next slide. Look, this is meant to convey When I was in Ohio, I did quite a bit of work in this sort of grid modernization space. And what this slide is meant to convey is that the grid of yesterday is going to look very different than the grid of tomorrow. The grid of yesterday was a very simple sort of one-way communication, generating a watt, then transmitting the watt, and then distributing that watt to those who needed it, to the load. Now, with technology advancing the way it is, with the concept of intermittent resources that are appearing on the grid, with the concept of the change in sort of preferences from our consumers and our businesses. Wanting to see a little car there, wanting to make sure that their electric vehicle is, plugging in their electric vehicle is not creating power flow issues, or is something that is affordable to them. The desire to advance, your own home-based generation system, and then the technology being better such that two-way communication flow is in fact possible. The grid of yesterday is dramatically changing. The technology, we talk about this technology with some consistency. Some of it's there, some of it isn't quite there yet with respect to being able to be commercially deployed. But if we aren't looking at these things, if RTOs aren't looking at these things, and we undoubtedly are, I think both MISO and PJM, looking at this grid of the future. I know that we've got, for instance, quite a bit of activity in the storage space, utilizing storage as a transmission asset, valuation of storage in our markets, that, we want to make sure that we are prepared for whatever comes our way, because the system is changing so much. These are just a few of the technologies that are creating that change dynamic. That change dynamic includes, again, our intermittent resources. So things like renewable power, wind and solar, the ability to store power, which is something that has sort of, plagued the electricity industry. Think about the electricity industry and the gas industry, right? You can store natural gas, but you cannot necessarily store electricity. However, there are developers out there that are trying to change that equation through battery technology. We talked about distributed energy resources, the ability to put solar panels on your house or wind turbines at your place of business, and generate power for your own facility, and possibly even sell that power back to the grid. Energy efficiency is something that's been around for a while that folks know about. This customer behavior and choice. This is something we have done some work. PJM has done some work on this, and I know I did some work on this in the state of Ohio. Not all customers are built the same. We should not assume that customers want to do fancy stuff with their power consumption, or they want to put anything on their roof, or they want to change how they consume, or they want to be able to track how they consume. If you talk to my dad in the great state of Ohio, he'll tell you, hey, I read what you were doing with that grid modernization stuff. Can you please not mess around with my bill? And that's a segment of the customer population that, folks, should not ignore. But there are segments of the customer population that are sort of changing how they view their interaction with electricity in their homes and in their businesses. And it's something that we've got to be thoughtful of. Alternative technologies, again, electric vehicles are going to be something that we're all going to contend with, I think, from purely a power grid and, frankly, regulation space going forward. And then the fuel swap. I think one thing to point out is that PJM's markets, they undergo their own evolution based upon some of the useful life of assets in the footprint, as well as technology that advances, that sort of displaces some of those assets. So one thing that we have undoubtedly seen within our footprint is a sort of swap in in really a couple of our generating resources or types of resources, which are coal and natural gas. So still have a large presence in the fuel mix across the entire PJM footprint. If you look at Indiana, for instance, you need quite a bit of natural gas that's in the interconnection queue within PJM. Let me move on. Sorry. This is one of our last slides, and a point to be made about this slide is, we're just talking about, so let's leave the physical grid aside for just a second and sort of, who are the players in the electricity space, the bulk power system space. So one thing to point out, it's important to point out that, PJM, it has a regulator. Again, we're not the same as sort of publicly traded utilities, but we are technically legally a public utility, and we are regulated by the FERC. I often get questions, especially in the state policy space, why can't PJM just do X? We have the opportunity to talk about it within our stakeholder process, maybe if we come to some consensus, but for instance, take the capacity market discussion, the MOPR, which is something that you hear about quite a bit. You can't just say, we're not going to implement the MOPR. We have a regulator. Our regulator is the FERC. When the regulator makes a decision the same way that when the IURC makes a decision with respect to its utilities, that directive needs to be followed by RTOs. So that's one point to make about this. I think, another point is, where do state commissions fit into all of this? Where do state policymakers fit into all of this? I think on the jurisdictional spectrum, you've got the bulk power system, which is really FERC, RTOs, and the NERC. And then you've got states who do have some ability to effectuate change in the bulk power system, depending on whether or not their utilities are vertically integrated in the generation space. And then you've got clearly the distribution system that states have total purview over. Again, I described our relationship with states. They advance policy that we as an entity have to take into account. In fact, we have just advanced an endeavor at PJM that we call State Policy Solutions. And the goal of that endeavor is to not act as a hindrance to state policy initiatives, but actually to help states advance those policy initiatives. Now, the obvious question is, how do you homogenize all of these things? And the answer is, I don't have a great answer for you, other than we as an entity, we as an RTO, we need to be able to have the open, transparent, honest conversation with states about the advancement of where they're situated from a policy perspective. States are the closest to their consumers from purely a governmental standpoint. The IURC is in touch with consumers from all pockets of the state of Indiana. We have to take that into account and into consideration, help states advance their initiatives, hopefully on the front end. So when they're being developed, we can say, hey, look, here's what we think is technically feasible, or here's what we think actually works within the market construct that the FERC has ordered us to advance. But even on the back end, just helping states advance those initiatives is something that we take very seriously at PJM, and is a directive that I've specifically provided to my team that we need to be helping states in the advancement here and the hopeful eventual implementation of these state policies. My last slide, there's another really important entity that we haven't spent time talking about here, and that is the NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation. And so really how that relationship works is NERC promulgates reliability standards for our systems. And we work cooperatively with the NERC. The NERC sort of takes its, at least I would say, strategic pecking orders from the FERC and then sits down to figure out and ensure that they are promulgating the right reliability standards that RTOs adhere to. And then the last thing we'll mention here is the IRC. As you can read here, it's an organization that basically serves to try and tie together the RTO so that we're talking to each other about some of the most important issues that are facing our individual organizations and our collective footprint. As you span RTOs, you go back to that initial 9 RTO slide that span across all the various RTOs. So with that, I have done a ton of talking, and so I am more than happy to field a few questions if we've got them.
Do we have any questions? If you're on YouTube, be sure you use the chat box feature, or in the alternative, like I said, you could send them questions to Bob Pauley by his email. It's what did I say it was? It's Pauley, Pauley at urc.in.gov. While we're waiting to see if some questions come in, Sim, I was wondering if you could go into a little bit more about how the stakeholder process works, and then more specifically, I think just by amount of geography that's covered in the state of Indiana by MISO, that people are more familiar with how the MISO stakeholder process works, and also how the OMS interacts with the MISO. They probably have much less familiarity with the PJM stakeholder process and how PJM interacts with OPSI, because it's a very different animal. OMS versus OPSI.
Yeah. I would say, so first of all, with respect to the stakeholder process, that is a big chunk of education in and of itself. But there are 2 primary committees within the stakeholder process. That's the members committee and then the markets and reliability committee, and then a series of committees that are sort of underneath that, those 2 primary committees. Now, OPSI oftentimes does come, the actual executive director of OPSI actually comes to and vocalizes his opinion within those committee structures. We oftentimes will get states who will also either fly in or drive in or call in, because that's always a possibility, to participate within our stakeholder process structure. Where there is, I think, some difference between OMS and OPSI is that with respect to OPSI, OPSI doesn't actually vote within the stakeholder process framework. But what I'll say is that when we get correspondences from OPSI, or we are provided positions by OPSI, those positions are taken very, very seriously by the organization. I've had this conversation with a series of commissioners across our footprint, and should OPSI itself be a member at PJM, or should the states be members at PJM? And what I say is, look, that's really a decision that is up to you. You have the ability in all stakeholder process settings to voice your opinion about where you think something should go. And clearly, a lot of the members in the room are subject to some form of jurisdiction from those states. So those members listen as well. So you always have that ability. But what I say about the OPSI voice is, again, I do view it as almost like a super member, because if OPSI joins sort of the membership, or if states join the membership, I think you saw that we have 1,000+ members at PJM. We have 2 different classes: voting members and sort of affiliate members, non-voting members. And so, OPSI itself would be one of, a number of members unless we were able to sort of change that sort of voting structure. Same thing with the states. So, my guidance to OPSI has been in the past, or my thinking and just having conversations with commissioners, keep your sort of super status as policymakers who don't get in the sort of melee and some of the frankly horse trading that goes on. I don't think the membership would mind me saying that because they know it happens within the sort of stakeholder process setting. So different, certainly, than how I think MISO operates within the stakeholder process, or where states sit within the stakeholder process. But my notion is a similar outcome, because my notion is that MISO, by legislation or otherwise, is very sensitive to where their states are situated on a number of issues. So I'm sure some real similarities there. Hey, Bob, you might be on mute.
Hey, Ryan, did you say, Hadley, did you say that there was someone on a chat box with a question?
Yes, the question is, can you elaborate a little more on the role that NERC plays in developing reliability standards? There have been questions in Indiana about who is responsible for ensuring a reliable system.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan, for that question. I think the honest answer is that it is a shared responsibility. So when we can bucket off one item, okay, which is the distribution system. So the regulatory body in Indiana will have responsibility from a regulatory perspective of enforcing reliability standards, CAIDI, SAIDI, SAFE standards, with respect to the distribution utilities in the state. And then it's the distribution utilities' responsibility to ensure that they are adhering to those standards. When you then, so let's move from now local to bigger. Let's move to beyond the distribution system to the transmission system to generators, okay? So ultimately, it is the FERC that is responsible for reliability. But what they do is they direct the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, to promulgate these standards. Now, I actually used to serve on the NERC member representative committee when I was in Ohio. I was one of 2 state appointees to that committee. And what ends up happening is that you have all of these transmission owners, generation owners, folks who exist within the bulk power system, who talk about how these standards should be created, and then NERC eventually takes these standards, typically pushes them unless they've sort of received a directive from FERC to allow for the change to be made. Will then go through their committee process and then possibly blessed by the FERC, depending on what it is. So you've got the FERC, the NERC. I would say that RTOs are an important player in this space. We do need to make sure that we are adhering to NERC standards. We undergo sort of our own auditing function. So we need to make sure we're adhering to NERC standards. Transmission owners need to adhere to NERC standards. Generation owners need to adhere to NERC standards. So with respect to the bulk power system, because of the interstate and, again, interregional coordination elements, there are quite a few players in the reliability space. And, PJM, transmission owners, generation owners, we're all part of that mix. We've got the control room assets. Obviously, transmission owners have control over their assets, and generation owners have control over their assets. And then from the physical sort of paper standpoint, you're really looking at from the regulatory paradigm, you're really looking at FERC directing NERC, and NERC being sort of the brain trust that advances these reliability standards. So I hope that's helpful.
Okay, I have another question that's come through on the chat. Let me see if I can get back to it and read the question. This question is from Steve Francis, and he's asking, how do you incorporate broader goals such as climate change in your planning?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it is a question that, from purely sort of a vision perspective, that we're tackling right now. Look, historically, our primary pillars for the RTO, and again, my perspective on this is sort of outsider's perspective looking in, and then, being here since March of last year. Reliability, okay, and affordability. We'll just call it affordability. We used to be sort of the jargon used to be reliability at least cost. Okay, I think we have to acknowledge sort of the what's happening in the climate space, both the social movement as well as the science. There has to be an acknowledgement of where of sort of these trends. Okay, I think being blind to those things is not helpful to the RTO or to the organization. As far as actually taking that element and, for instance, infusing it into markets, that is something that we are having conversations about both internally and externally right now. The idea of where climate fits into, for instance, the energy market, in the event that states advance carbon pricing, how to best implement that in an energy market in tandem with, let's say that, let's say in the resource, from a resource adequacy perspective, let's say that there's more and more drive and push to bring renewable resources or zero carbon resources, either keep zero carbon resources alive or bring more renewables, onto the system. How does that work within the marketplace? And so we're having those conversations internally and externally about climate. Now, from a planning perspective, from just purely again, think about planning, operations, and markets. From a planning and operations perspective, we're already very well sort of down the path of thinking about how to best incorporate intermittent resources into the physical, the cyber physical grid. So I think the policy conversation really sort of is really surrounding the markets component of, again, recall planning, operations, markets. That's sort of the policy discussion. But with respect to the actual physics and engineering of the grid, the planning and operations function, if you look at the PJM interconnection queue, what you'll really see is that you've got natural gas fire generation that's in the interconnection queue, and you have a lot of renewables in the interconnection queue. So if we're doing our jobs as planners and operators of the physical grid, we have to be thinking about how to best incorporate these intermittent resources into the grid. It's the sort of the policy and markets dynamic, which I think right now is a challenge, for a number of RTOs, not just PJM, whose charge now is, because of these sort of movements around climate change that exist around us, that we are trying to figure out, frankly, how to contend with when our pillars have been sort of reliability at least cost.
Hey, Ryan, I just want to make sure that there aren't any other questions on the chat feature, because for some reason on my computer, I keep getting that it cannot connect to the chat feature. So, and Bob thinks it's working on for him, but we're not sure either. So you see
there are no more questions on the live chat that I can see.
Okay. We have a break scheduled for right now. What we'll do is we'll start off, pick it up at 10:15 with the next item on the agenda, which will be the issue of resource adequacy. And hopefully by that time, we can figure out on our end what's going on with our ability to read the chat question. So we'll pick it up again at 10:15. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr.
Yes,
Chairman.
Thank
It's
you,
been a pleasure,
Sim.
and best of luck for the rest of the day. And thank you, Bob. Bye now.
Yep.
Welcome to WebEx. Enter your attendee ID number.
Hey, Tim, turn your sound off on your computer. That'll help prevent the echo.
Hey, Bob Kuzman, are you there? Do we have our MISO speaker ready to go for the resource adequacy topic?
Yes, we do. This is Stuart Hansen with MISO. Can you hear me okay?
Okay, great. I was just wondering who it was because none of your names are on the presentation, so I wasn't sure who was who.
Gotcha. Yeah. I'll cover this portion, and then I believe my director, Zach Jundi, will be doing the next portion after lunch, the lunch break here.
Okay. And then we'll have Tom Phelan from PJM, and we'll have to do the sharing there.
Thank you, Stuart.
All right, now. All right, I believe we are ready to go, and that the YouTube connection is still operating and they're ready to go there. Am I correct on that, Patrick, if you're on?
Correct.
Okay, so let's get started here with the next topic. It's going to be dealing with resource adequacy. And this first speaker will be from the MISO. His name is Stuart Hansen. He will give a little bit of background on himself. And then PJM will be speaking on the same topic. And I believe that's Tom, is it Phelan or Fallon? And he will obviously give his background and stuff before he gets going on his presentation. And this will go to 11:30, and we should hopefully have plenty of time for questions at the end, with the objective of breaking for lunch at 11:30. So with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Hansen to give us the MISO perspective on resource adequacy.
That sounds good. And I believe I am sharing my screen here. Let me know if you can see it.
Yes,
Okay.
We can.
Great. Well, thank you, Chairman Houston and commissioners for having us here today. Very important to touch base on these kind of things, and I'm very thankful to be able to participate. Just going to have a very brief conversation about, what is resource adequacy in general, and then one of the ways we sort of measure that or have a metric that we use to discuss with our stakeholders, that is the OMS MISO survey. I believe our previous presenters have talked a little bit about what OMS is, and already the organization MISO states. So this is really a collaboration between our state commissions and utility regulatory bodies and MISO, but we'll dive into that here shortly. So resource adequacy is really our planning for the ability to serve load all hours of the year with the generation that we have in our generation mix. A little bit about MISO is we actually have 17 jurisdictions, 15 states, New Orleans and Manitoba, 38 local balancing authorities, 52 transmission operator owners, and over 6,000 generating units in our system to balance. Now, it's not really MISO's obligation or MISO's authority to direct anybody to build generation. So what we try to do is provide transparency through our assessments and in our open stakeholder processes. And it's really the state commissions ensure resource adequacy through integrated resource plans and other similar hearings. So part of our providing that transparency, we use a sort of midterm, what we call a midterm tool is the OMS MISO survey. And we'll look at a little bit more what that means in a second. But we effectively have our energy market and our real-time and day-ahead markets that look at NINUP generation in the minutes to hours to upcoming days kind of cycle. We have our planning resource auction that looks at adequate reserves in the next year. And then this survey sort of fills in the gap between what some IRPs are 10, 15, or 20 years. And this OMS MISO survey looks at the 10-year span, really narrowing in on a 5-year period, which you'll see in just a second here. The survey, we kind of initiated this collaboration with OMS in 2012 and actually presented on the first time in 2013. So this is our 8th iteration of the survey. What we look to do here is we align our loads that our load serving entities have the obligation to serve with what generation we have available. Our approach has evolved over this 8 years that we've done this, initially just targeting those with the obligation to serve load. But what that failed to do was look at how much generation is available to our system that's not planning to go anywhere. And so, essentially our independent power producers or our utilities that have excess capacity that's not intended to serve their load, we needed to more appropriately account for that. So we now actually survey anybody who has any kind of capacity in our system and registers in our capacity tracking tool, or has any load that they're obligated to serve that is entered in the same tool. So now we have an integrated system that the survey is a part of that same tool. So anybody who submits a load or submits a resource has the option to submit a response in our voluntary OMS MISO survey. Now, one big thing to point out is that we do just call this a snapshot in time. We understand that utilities resource plans change, load forecasts change, and units that are in our interconnection queue, they make progress year by year. So every year is going to look slightly different. This is really a tool to offer some transparency and really just to facilitate a conversation around what our future resource adequacy might look like. So here's a graphic on sort of the different ranges that I kind of highlighted a couple of slides ago. We have our very near-term things, and then when we were talking about this in 2012, we had kind of a gap between the IRPs and our, at the time we were developing this, we didn't have a functioning capacity market, but the resource adequacy constructs that we had there were still, very near term. So we initiated this survey to try to kind of fill that gap and to create a tool that all of our stakeholders could use. So then what happens with the submissions is our entities populate all of their responses on, yes, are these the loads that we're obligated to serve? Yes, these are the resources we'll be relying on. And then each utility can get a balance sheet of, here's what we submitted to MISO, and here is where we'll kind of project ourselves over the coming year, or excuse me, the coming decade. Now, all of this is very confidential. It is our Module E capacity tracking tool, the MECT as it's called. All of those submissions are confidential, so we try to preserve that confidentiality and maintain our members' trust, but we work with our commissions, and I believe many commissions ask their utilities for their individual balance sheets. So we work very diligently with them to make sure that what they see on their end for their resource projections is what's represented in those balance sheets, so that we have as good of understanding as we can of how they will be serving load in the coming decade. As you know, the uncertainty increases over time. So although we collect data for 10 years out, we really try to just drill down to the 5-year period because that's sort of where we had the biggest gap between the resource plans that were already out there and our existing planning processes at the time. So here's an initial 5-year snapshot from our 2020 results, and this reflects the results over the entire footprint. I'm going to spend a minute just on how to read this slide. I know it's a little bit confusing, but we'll kind of start at the middle. The line through the center of the chart represents our planning reserve margin on an installed capacity basis, which this year was an 18% planning reserve margin. So you'll see gigawatt values above or below that line. And if we start on the left, you'll see we have committed capacity. So in the survey, respondents will tell us we're going to rely on this resource with a high degree of certainty, or they're going to rely on a given resource, but they're not sure that they'll actually be there or not. So that's what you see as the potentially unavailable resources. That is the 4.7 gigawatts on the far left for 2021. On top of that, we have potential new capacity, and this is generation that is in our interconnection queue and is on track to receive capacity credit in the 2021-2022 planning resource auction. Working your way to the left, it gets a little bit more confusing on how to interpret this. We've added these brackets to show what the potentially unavailable resources are. As soon as our committed capacity falls below that planning reserve margin line, you'll see that indicated in a solid red color. So our high certainty resources will still leave us 0.4 gigawatts short of our 18% reserve margin in 2022. What we're adding on top of that is 3.1 gigawatts of low certainty resources that leaves us potentially 2.7 gigawatts above that reserve margin. And then you'll see the new capacity is added on top of that. So we have a wide range of possible outcomes. And so that's why we're not putting too much weight on any one of these numbers. What we're presenting with these is a range. And as we keep going to the right, that range starts to expand and starts to fall a little bit further below. But this is not us trying to, scream the sky is falling. This is just us it's saying this is what we're told through our survey process. So, keep these things in mind when you're conducting your planning processes. The further we go to the right, you'll see in 2024 is the first year that those potentially unavailable resources don't quite get us back above the planning reserve margin. So what that indicates is that even if all of those low certainty resources stay online, we will need new generation by 2024 and then 2025 to be made whole or have adequate resources to serve the planning reserve margin. Now, one other thing to point out why this is a snapshot in time is that this reserve margin changes year by year. It was 16% and change last year. That jumped up to 18 this year, and it will change again for our next 21 and 2022 planning year. So all of these things change every year, and this is just the way this 5-year snapshot looks. Looking on our zonal level, we'll kind of zoom in on 2021. You'll see on the left, it's the same numbers, except for we've lumped together the potentially unavailable and potential new capacity, just to make what we're seeing on the right a little simpler. By zone, you'll see the certain capacity in the solid color, and then the low certainty or potential capacity is represented by what's in the hash marks. Now, for our conversation today, I'll zoom in on zone 6 here and show that in the near term, there's Indiana was indicating that, or zone 6, which includes parts of Kentucky, is indicating that they will be at least 400 megawatts long of their reserve margin requirement in 2021, and then possibly an additional 100 megawatts on top of that, so half of a gigawatt long. An interesting note here is that there's none of the low certainty resources in 2021 in zone 6. So this is all just new unit additions in the near term here. So a little bit of tracking from how did zone 6 look in our 2019 survey to the 2020 survey. Last year, we had seen zone 6 potentially 300 megawatts short in our OMS MISO survey for the 2021 planning year. Now, if you look at there's sort of a decrease in load, but with that decrease in load, even the increased reserve margin still brought down the reserve margin obligation slightly. There's a large change in available resources that was somewhat netted out by some of the decreases in load modifying resources that's behind the meter generation and demand response. but we did see an increase in imports to the zone. So that's what gives us that 400 megawatts potential long position. And then you see the 100 megawatts of potential new capacity on top of that. So our 5-year outlook, this is where we were looking the most short across the system. This is showing it by zone here. And again, this is not trying to raise any alarm bells or anything. It's a way that we're evaluating what we're seeing in our interconnection queue and what the survey responses we get are. So a couple things to note here is there's a very wide range for zone 6, and how this is represented in the survey is there's about 1,800 megawatts of generation that was indicated that it was low certainty of being available in 2025. And then the other half of that is 1,800 megawatts of potential new capacity. One important piece about the survey, however, is that not all generation capacity is given its reserve contribution because of where it's at in the queue. We know that units in our interconnection queue withdraw at different rates. The highest withdrawal rates are on our pre-study, and then in our phase 1. And then units in our phase 2 and phase 3 withdraw at lower and lower rates until they get their signed generator interconnection agreements, or GIAs. So we actually weight what's in our queue by how much or how far along it is in that queue process. So just a couple things to point out here. This 1,800 megawatts that I said made up half of this range. It's actually a gig and a half of solar capacity, 200 megawatts of wind capacity, and 100 megawatts of batteries. And where these are at different points in the queue will actually translate to 11 gigawatts of nameplate solar, a gig and a half of nameplate wind, and just over a gigawatt of nameplate battery. So as these units progress along the queue, those will get higher and higher weights. We're just right now acknowledging that if it's in the phase 1 or not started, it has a high chance of potentially withdrawing. But as those progress, their weights will increase, and you'll see this kind of window narrow up. So we show this to you just to facilitate this conversation, not to point fingers or raise the alarm at all. So here's that look broken down a little bit more granular here for the 2025 year. Just shows that same range stacked against what the demand plus reserve obligation is. And you'll see the high certainty resources with firm imports. On top of that shows our total committed capacity in that middle blue column. And then we didn't see any interzonal capacity transactions to other zones in the system. So then you'll see the potential resources on top of that. And again, like I said, half of that's low certainty. The other half is potential new that will get increasing contribution the further along it gets in our interconnection queue. And that is actually the end of my slides. I kind of sprinted there. I don't want to take up more than my time. Any questions?
Let me check here. Let me check here if we have any.
We do have a separate OMS-MISO survey email that you can write myself, or if you get questions to Bob Kuznin, he can forward them to me. I'm happy to take questions offline after this as well if they come up. And we'll be talking more on resource adequacy in depth too. So always more chances to follow up.
This is Brad. I'll ask a couple of questions. Are you on mute? So that who is responsible for doing the load forecasting in the MISO? I mean, I know it's different than the PJM. So for our list participants here, who does the load forecasting?
That's a great question. Our utilities are, our members are. We get their load forecast, their 50/50 load forecast through our Module E capacity tracking tool. Based on those responses, We aggregate them all up. They give us a coincident peak to the MISO. We give them likely points of when the system will peak, and they give us their coincident peak for the first year. Then they give us their non-coincident peak, so what their individual respective peaks will be for the next 10 years. Using that coincidence factor, we calculate a 10-year coincident peak forecast, and that's what these results are stacked up against.
Brad, there's a question on the YouTube stream. Looking at slide 6, are these ICAP numbers based on utility-only resources, or is it all resources within the zone?
That's a good question. These are all resources within each zone, and to the extent that our transmission or capacity transfers are capable, this also reflects transactions from one utility to the next. We have utilities that own capacity in both zones, and they can contract that across the zone. So we reflect what are called zonal resource credits here as well. So this reflects their balances, including everything that they've transacted up to the ability for the zone to import or export.
Looks like Brad may have run into some internet connection problems. If the presenter next is ready to go, I don't see any other questions coming in, and we'll still have some time for some questions after the next presentation.
Thank you, Stuart.
You're welcome. Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks. And this is Tim Burtis with PJM. I see my video seems to be off. It may end up coming back. So let me first just start off by thanking the chairman, the commissioners, as well as the staff for the opportunity to speak to you all today about resource adequacy and PJM. And I also appreciate Stuart's setting the stage here and discussing MISO's role here on resource adequacy for the state of Indiana. A little bit of quick background about myself. I've been at PJM for about 15 years, a little bit over 15 years here. Been in various roles in both markets and operations. I came over to our state government policy group at the company about 5 years ago. Took a brief opportunity to work over as chief of staff for our general counsel about a year ago, and most recently came back over into PJM State Government Policy Group, where I'm leading and building out a new unit called State Policy Solutions. So you all heard from Awesome Hawk earlier today. I report up to Awesome Hawk as we try to build out this new organization inside our State Government Policy Group that's really working, intending to work directly with the states on advancing their policy solutions. Educationally, I have a master's in software engineering from West Virginia University and a master's candidate at Penn Law School. So with that out of the way, you heard from Stuart here on resource adequacy and how it's done in MISO. I'll talk a little bit about how we do it in PJM. It is a little bit different because there's regional differences between the states in MISO and the states in PJM. And I'll also provide a little bit of context here for how Indiana is even different than some other states inside PJM in how it is they go about resource adequacy. So first, let me just start off by talking about what is resource adequacy. And, please indulge me here if this is a little bit too elementary, but, I tend to like to bring everything back to food personally. And so this is, Brad, this is not this panel's presentation, just as a heads up. I don't have a presentation for this. Cool. So I like to bring everything back to food, right? And so when I think about what it is PJM does in our energy market, what we do when, as consumers, we turn on our air conditioners and we're actually consuming energy versus what the RTOs do with respect to resource adequacy, again, I think about it in terms of food. And so when I need to go turn on my air conditioner, today, and I need to use energy coming out of the wires, that to me looks like the preparation of a meal or the delivery of a meal, right? An actual plate of food that's sitting before me. But when I think about resource adequacy is more about the ingredients that go into preparing that meal. And it's having them ready and on the standby to be able to prepare that meal when you want it. And so in PJM, because of our regional differences and the differences in state policies, and I'll talk about those in a minute here, we look at resource adequacy really in almost two ways, which is who decides the ingredients in the first instance. And it's almost like a cooking show, right? So is it a basket of ingredients that's already prepared for the chef, and they just got to open up the lid, and then that's their ingredients that they either get to use for preparing the meal, or does the chef get to go out and pick his or her own ingredients and do it for the meal? And that's really what we're talking about here in the PJM dynamic, where we have states that are still traditionally regulated. We have 7 states in PJM, Indiana obviously being one of them, where they own and control and retain full resource adequacy responsibilities through duly enacted commission proceedings through things like IRPs. And so that is the analogy there of the baskets already being decided, obviously through a detailed and deliberative process, but those ingredients are being decided and put into the basket in the first instance for the meal to be prepared. In our deregulated states, PJM has 7 deregulated states, and it's the majority of our demand. Those states in the 1990s had elected to deregulate or remove the responsibility of state public utility commissions from overseeing generation supply. And they had said, we're going to turn that responsibility about what these ingredients are over to the marketplace. And the consumers will choose what resources they ultimately want in terms of getting that meal at the end of the day. And so we had to construct a resource adequacy model that can really address both of those types of regulatory dynamics. And so at first, in 1998, when PJM went live with the wholesale market and we implemented locational marginal pricing just for the energy market, we were an energy-only market. We had energy, we ultimately had some ancillary services, but our resource adequacy was really more of a check and balance to make sure load had some capacity coming up for the next operating day, but there was no long-term view, no responsibility of the load to have committed resources over the next year, 2 years, 3 years. And so that worked appropriately for several years. And then about 2003 to 2004, some of the resources, particularly in congested areas around the Baltimore, D.C. area and over in the congested areas of New Jersey, we're starting to run into revenue adequacy issues. And if their retirements had gone through, because of their localized and nature of the transmission system there and where they were located at, there would have been some reliability issues with being able to serve the load in those areas. And so, PJM went back to the drawing board and said, well, we need to take a look at what is the underpinning issue here around the revenue adequacy concerns. And you could tackle the problem through a couple of ways, right? Because what you're talking about is a couple of peaker units that are only going to run a few hours out of the year, and they need to get all of their revenue in just those few couple of hours, because that's just where peak demand is, and the rest of the year demand is well under that, and those units don't need to run. So you could change your energy market rules, and you could allow some volatility in the energy market, let prices shoot up really high, let prices float to that level whenever supply is short. Or you could look at something that's a little bit more longer term, like what we have at PJM now, which is a capacity market, which is intended to smooth out some of that volatility and provide a longer term viewpoint to resources and to investors about where their revenue position is going to be coming 3 years into the future, and they receive a commitment. And so that's a model that works, again, mostly for the deregulated states to ensure that their load is committed 3 years into the future to make sure there's adequate steel in the ground to meet their future demand. And that's where we've ended up going with this dynamic. It's not to say that traditionally regulated states can't and don't participate in the capacity market, but it's not necessary that they have to. And so in the case of Indiana, as you all are probably aware, through Indiana, Michigan's integrated resource plan that's been filed, the Indiana portion of Indiana, Michigan in particular, participates in what's known as the fixed resource requirement. And so the fixed resource requirement is effectively a way for a load serving entity to opt out of PJM's capacity market and say, look, I have enough resources on my own. In the case of AEP in Indiana, Michigan, they do it through the state's IRP process, but I have enough resources on my own to meet my demand. And so I don't need to utilize your capacity market, PJM. Thank you very much, but I'm going to use my basket of ingredients to cook the meal when we ultimately get there. And so that's really the way that Indiana goes about satisfying its resource adequacy obligations in the PJM footprint of Indiana, is to utilize this fixed resource requirement. And, you know, they come to the table, they being the LSC comes to the table with its own basket of resources, how it's going to meet its demand that's set by PJM. And, you know, we just verify that those resources actually meet up against the demand. And then we, you know, check throughout the delivery year when we're actually into the operation that those resources are eligible and able to maintain the capacity commitment that they've agreed to. And so that's really the way in which resource adequacy for the state of Indiana is conducted inside PJM. It is not as lively, I would say, as in some of the rest of the states, those deregulated states that have elected to deregulate and utilize the capacity market, because the outcomes there are a little bit different. They're not necessarily predefined. So with that is a high-level overview. The only other area I would add is that you know, the FRR resources, you know, those fixed resource requirement resources do still participate in the rest of PJM markets, energy and ancillary services. They have just as much opportunity to do that, and they're still dispatched through the PJM system operations model. So it's really just the carve out of the capacity market or the resource adequacy function that we have in place. So with that, I will pause and turn it back to Brad.
Okay, do we have any questions out there that have come through? Hey, Ryan, do you see any in the chat box? Because I still can't get into the chat feature.
There are no questions yet at this time.
Okay. Let me ask a quick question here for both speakers. How do you guys go about setting the appropriate reserve margin? I mean, what drives that for the region? How is that determined? Why does it change from year to year? And also, how do you determine if the reserve margin should differ from region to region, you know, sub-region by sub-region in your geographic territories?
Hi, this is Stuart Hansen. I'm happy to jump in first here. So we annually conduct our loss of load expectation study. So that looks at, you know, what is our likelihood of losing load due to generation, you know, failure of our generation fleet. We're looking at the very common industry metric of that 1 day in 10, or you know, one outage in 10 years kind of probability. So then conducting that, it changes year by year due to things like the forced outage rates of our units, so unit performance, which sometimes trends with their age, as well as our load shape changes. So we see it change based on both of those, how we're consuming electricity and then how our units are performing. And that goes for both our dispatchable and our intermittent resources. Zonally, we look at what are on the transmission side, we look at our capacity import and export constraints. So looking at sort of our monitored flow gates between those zones. That's not something I can speak to specifically to, but just my understanding is we evaluate it every year to see if the transmission topology has changed that would accommodate any more transactions between the zones, or if anything was decommissioned that would decrease that. But we do that annually as well.
Yeah, so this is Tim Burtis at PJM, and I think Stuart really touched upon the high points that are very similar to how we conduct our process here at PJM. And I will just note that I believe he's on the phone right now is Tom Fallon. Tom Fallon is actually the person responsible at PJM for managing what is our annual reserve requirement study that goes about actually producing that installed reserve margin. The only other difference I would note is that at least with respect to the fixed resource requirement resources, that installed reserve margin is the fixed determinant that the LSC actually procures up to, and does not need to go over and above that installed reserve margin. In PJM with our capacity market, we do allow the market to clear beyond the installed reserve margin where it is economic to do so. Again, bringing it back to food, the example I use is if it's $10 per pound for lunch meat, that would be a higher area to clear at than if you were able to get 3 pounds at $3 per pound, where it would just be a $9 clearing. So that's really the function by which the demand curve allows us to clear over and above the installed reserve margin, where it becomes more economic to do so, where you can actually get higher levels of supply at an overall reduced cost than you otherwise would. But again, that's just the market resources, not the FRR resources or load.
Okay, we have another question here from the Commission's Dave Johnston. It's a 3-part question, so I'll give you all 3 parts and then let you guys answer. MISO first, PJM second. The first part is, how is capacity defined in terms of how many hours and days it is required to be available to provide energy? The second question is, how will limited duration resources such as storage be incorporated in your construct? Maybe there's only 2 parts there. So if you need me to reread the questions, just let me know.
No, I think that was clear. So my understanding is we require 4-hour dispatch capability for a unit to qualify. Where we look at this the most is for demand response. I think the majority of the programs can have up to maybe 4 or 5 calls a year, and then need to be able to deliver that for up to 4 hours to get the full capacity credit, for their resource. How that will happen for, say, batteries that only have a 2-hour capability, I'm not sure if we would just simply do a if anything less than 4, we'll do whatever percentage of that 4 hours. I think that's still being worked out, so it's kind of too early to say. I believe that was the second part of the question, but yeah, generally I think we need to be able to dispatch for up to 4 hours at a given call.
Yeah, so this is
Okay.
Tim Burtis. So what we had done is a few years ago, we had implemented what is known as capacity performance, which really is if we call on you, you got to perform. And so that's really sort of the initial threshold of whether or not the units are participating and what their requirements are for being able to enter into the market. Is that's a risk that they're taking, is that they will be able to perform. And if it's an extended period of a performance assessment hour, meaning that we're in an emergency, a capacity emergency, then you need to be able to run and predict that you're going to be able to run for that full period of time. With respect to storage, and this is an evolving issue, and this is continuing to change as a result of FERC Order 841. We do have, that 10-hour rule that we're working through, but effectively, if you're a 10-hour battery, if you're a 10-megawatt battery, and you can only run at full capacity, say for 1 hour, then we would give you the equivalent of 1 megawatt of capacity to offer into the market. And so that's the way by which we would derate, a storage resource such as that. Again, that is an evolving issue right now, though.
Okay, this is Brad. I have another question from the Commission's Dale Thomas. This is for PJM. Is a zone FRR or a specific LSE FRR? For example, how is a merchant generator within the I&M zone counted in the PJM resource adequacy construct?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you for it. So from a generator side, as long as you are not a part of an FRR plan, then you participate in the market. And in the case of resources located, say, in Indiana, merchant generators in Indiana that participate in the capacity market and are not a part of an FRR plan, they clear in what is the rest of RTO or the unconstrained zone or Western RTO. It goes by several different names. So just because that locale is the load in that locale has elected FRR, it doesn't preclude any of the merchant generators from participating in the capacity market. They just clear in that geographic region the same as anything else. With respect to the load side, what elects FRR? So it does have to be what we call a fully metered boundary. And so this becomes a little bit more relevant in the deregulated states where you have alternative suppliers that can serve my house and maybe somebody's house a couple of towns over and a couple of houses 3 towns over from there. And they're not able to unilaterally elect FRR because it's not a contiguous area. It's not a fully metered zone. So it's not something that we can just carve out easily and say, okay, well, alternative supplier 1 has this much load in this locale, so we can just take all of its load out and let them go FRR. So that being said, qualification to be an FRR entity is traditionally somebody that owns distribution wires. Let's think of it that way. So it could be your traditional vertically integrated utility. It could be a municipal power company. It could be a cooperative. Those are traditionally the 3 flavors of that. And if the distribution utility or the transmission utility, even for that matter, elects to go FRR, the public power entities that are connected up to there have the option, if they want to either be part of that FRR plan together, go it alone, have their own FRR plan, or remain in the market themselves. So there is some variability there as to how optionality is probably a better word, some optionality there as to how the FRR could be deployed. But again, it's really got to be somebody that's a distribution or a wires type company that elects the FRR. Great question.
Okay, this is Brad again. We have another question from Sean Brady. If PJM has some zones with higher production costs than neighboring zones, does PJM look to add transmission to lower production cost so a high cost zone can meet reserve margins at a lower cost?
Yeah, we do. And that comes, obviously the annual RTEP where there are network upgrades from new generators or baseline upgrades for reliability issues, those get factored in each year, and they do improve our capacity transfer limits into constrained zones in particular. And so we reflect that on an annual basis coming up in each capacity auction. We also have what are market efficiency projects. The market efficiency projects are specifically intended to reduce congestion costs in the energy market. And what we do is we look at a factor of if you spend $1 on the market efficiency transmission project, then you better get back $1.25 in value to the consumers to do that. The reason I bring up the market efficiency projects are that even though they're very aligned and viewed through the energy market congestion costs, obviously that is tightly interwoven into our transfer limits in the capacity market as well. I can say with specific experience in the ComEd zone over the last 4 or 5 years, there have been a lot of projects that have gone in to really improve the transfer capability limit into the ComEd zone to help improve the disposition of additional resources coming in, where at first transfer limit may have been, say, 2,000 megawatts at the peak hour. I think that has since increased. I know well over 3,000. It might be even be approaching closer to 5,000 today.
Okay, this is Brad again. Hey, one thing I was going to say in terms of with regard to the MISO OMS survey, I will note under commission rules, integrated resource planning rules, those the 8 generation utilities in the state of Indiana provide their responses to that survey to the commission. They are confidential, and as part